Well, this was like a barn burner for me. I'd never heard this before in my life. You may never have heard it before in your life. You're going to hear about it as we move along in the Catalyst Code. And so I, got around and I got him, the security guard with Bob, the amazing speaker. I just want to thank you for coming into my second episode ever on the Catalyst Code. So I left an intro episode for you to kind of explain what I'm doing here and why I'm here in front of you. And I really appreciate that you followed me over to this space. So I thought that I would do this quick little second episode about how I started working with Bob Proctor, because that really was the catalyst for me. That really was what began to shift my whole life way back 30 years ago in 1994. And it is so important to recognize that the biggest thing about this was that I was already searching for a mentor. And when you search for the mentor does show up. And I certainly hope that I can be some help to you as a teacher and as a mentor as you move forward, creating big changes and possibilities in your own life. So dialing back to 1994, I was working at Remax International. I was climbing the corporate ladder. Everything was working as it should. I had my degrees. I had my house. I had all this stuff. I was making things happen, but it just seemed like a crawl. And I was feeling like, there's got to be something more to this. There's got to be a way to make this happen faster. There's got to be something that's a little more fulfilling for me. And so I started looking around. Well, the first book I ever picked up was Tony Robbins' Awaken the Giant Within. And that was a great pep talk. It was really great. It was really awesome. And then I was talking with a regional director in Remax who was reading Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And I was like, okay, I'll go pick up that book. Well, Napoleon Hill is a whole different book. It's a whole different book. I mean, he wrote that back in the 1920s. And so, it's thicker water, so to speak, but it was just so good. It was such amazing information. And while I was reading Think and Grow Rich, the headquarters company that I was working at in Denver was getting ready for their annual international convention, which was happening in Las Vegas. And so all of the worker bees at Remax International get assigned a duty when they're at the international headquarters. They bring all of us on, all hands on deck. We're going to make this event happen. And at the time, I think we had like 40,000, 50,000 Remax agents coming in from all over the world, really. So it was a big event. And somehow I was assigned to be the keynote speaker's bodyguard. Now, that's kind of funny if you ever meet me in person, because I'm like 5'2". I'm a little thing. But, I was supposed to be the person who was going to get the keynote speaker from the end of the keynote in that hall all the way through the convention center to where he was going to be teaching a workshop for an afternoon class. That was my job. And so I went to the event, and I sat in the front row to listen to this keynote speaker. And it turned out that it was Bob Proctor. I'd never heard about him. I'd never seen him before. He was some guy from Canada that they brought in. And it was absolutely riveting what he was talking about, because he was actually fashioning a bigger, more understandable story from the Think and Grow Rich Foundation about how your conscious mind and your subconscious mind work together to create your reality, and how, when you begin to recognize that, you can actually begin to change your reality, because you're changing what you're feeding into your conscious and your subconscious mind. Well, this was like a barn burner for me. I'd never heard this before in my life. You may never have heard it before in your life. You're going to hear about it as we move along in the Catalyst Code. But it was so amazing to me. And he was so riveting. And he finished the keynote. And so I, got around and I got him, the security guard with Bob, the amazing speaker. And as we were walking through this long, long hall to his next session, I could tell that he was very, very well known to many, many more people than me, because he had all kinds of people coming up to him and thanking him and saying that they'd been following him for years. And this was back in the early 90s, when we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have any of that stuff going on. We didn't have the internet. And he still had all these people who were just absolute rapt followers of his. And so as we're walking along in this long hall, I can still remember it was like really brightly lit. It was all these glass windows and everything. We're just chatting, chit-chatting back and forth. And I kind of said, just out of the blue, I said, I've been thinking of starting my own company. And I thought, what in the world did I just say? And he stopped and he turned and he looked at me And I thought, he's thinking the same thing. What in the world did that girl just say? And instead, he just kind of looked at me for a minute and he said, what kind of company do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm thinking of starting a freelance writing company. And he looked at me again and he goes, well, he said, just judging from the way you look, he said, you are so right-brained, there's no left in you. He said, I think you should do it. And then he kind of turned and he started briskly walking away. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like I can't even believe that I actually said that out loud. I hadn't even been thinking about it, let alone said it out loud to a complete stranger, let alone said it out loud to a complete stranger who was the keynote speaker of the big event, right? And so this is all going through my mind as I then try to catch up to him because I'm his bodyguard. I've got to get him to the right place. And it was really rolling through my mind. Well, I sat in his workshop at the back of the room and watched his whole workshop. And at the end of the workshop, he came up to me and he said, so what do you think? And I said, I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And he goes, I think that's a great idea. He said, I want to hear how that goes. And I said, okay, that's awesome. I'm going to let you know. Well, did I go back and resign from Remax and start my own freelance writing company? No, I didn't do that. No. Why? Because. I mean, the reasonable mind, my reasonable mind, which you're going to hear more about, it came up with all kinds of ideas and all kinds of reasons why I shouldn't be doing this. You know, this is what we call the paradigms, the habitual thinking patterns in your mind. These are paradigms. And when I teach my clients about paradigms, I say, you know, they're the excuse makers. And you have to think about it like every time you have a new idea or you decide that you're going to take this new action or you're going to move in this new direction or you're going to move across the country because you feel like it or whatever, you make this decision. And right as soon as you make the decision, your reasoning mind floats up, which is your paradigm. And it's like, but why? Why would you want to do something that drastic? Why would you want to do something that risky? Because your paradigm is your habitual way of thinking. It's been trained up in you ever since you were a child. And you've gained these thoughts along the way on safety, risk-free, solid, slow growing, don't rock the boat ideas. And that's how your paradigm likes it, because then you're safe. It's like the Truman Show. Remember the Truman Show with Jim Carrey? When he thinks that he's in this beautiful world that he loves participating in and he's grown up in it since he was a baby. And it's all this routine and it's all this way and it's always been done this way. And this is the way he's going to live his life out. And he's going to be married and he's going to have kids. And this is how they're going to live their lives out. And then all of a sudden, a big giant studio camera falls through the sky, the ceiling of the stage that he's on. And he begins to realize that he is in a staged world and it's a reality show that everyone in the world is watching. And he's the only one who didn't know, right? It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. So he's been protected in this bubble all his life. And all of a sudden, a new idea, meaning a stage light, has fallen through the ceiling of the sky. And now his whole world has changed. His whole perspective has changed. And when his perspective has changed, everybody scrambles around him. Everyone scrambles around him to try to keep him in the safety zone, to try to keep him in the safe zone, to convince him that that was just a passing fancy. That was nothing important. That was just something that happened that he just needs to forget about. And this is what your paradigm will tell you all the time. Oh, forget about it. Are you kidding me? Do you know how much work that takes? What makes you think that you can start a freelance writing company? You don't even have hardly any money in the bank. I mean, you just bought a house. What are you going to do about that mortgage? I mean, you actually have degrees in other stuff that has nothing to do with writing. And yeah, okay, so we know that you kind of got into the writing thing because you had to make ends meet. But this doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be your career. I mean, your career should be the degrees you had. Why are you trying to go down this rabbit hole even further with writing? And where did you come up with such a crazy idea? And how do you know how to run a business? And what are you going to do? How are you going to have health benefits? How are you going to put gas in your car? How are you going to put food? What about your dog? How are you going to feed your dog? All of these things come up. This is what I call the filing cabinet of excuses in your room, in your mind. So as soon as you come up with this idea, your paradigm walks upstairs and he comes up with a filing cabinet room. He goes into the filing cabinet room. I picture it like all those old computers that used to stand, like the big giant ones that were in these big tech rooms, right? But you've got filing cabinets and filing cabinets and filing cabinets. And it goes up to the closest one and it pulls the drawer open and it opens it and it says, oh, here's a good excuse. You don't have enough money. And if that doesn't work and you stay moving forward on your excited goal, it comes up with another file and it goes, oh, well, you're going to lose your health benefits. Comes up with another one. How are you going to pay for your mortgage? And then as you continue forward on your excited goal, it starts going into the real digs, way back into the archives. All those excuses that it maybe only had to bring up one time when it had to really back you off from jumping into this crazy, risky world that you have no idea what's going to happen in, right? So all of this is going on. So the convention happened in like March, and round about November, I was still working at RE/MAX International. And Bob was coming into town to do some teaching of our broker owners. And I got this wild idea. And, sometimes you're directed to have these wild ideas. I got this wild idea to call up to his office and ask if he could do lunch with me while he was down trading for the 3 days. And he said yes. He said yes. I left a message and Gina called me back and I said, this is what I would like to do. And she said, okay, that's fine. And she said, let me ask him if he's able to do that. And then she called me back. She goes, he can meet with you on Tuesday afternoon for lunch. Okay, so I took him to lunch. We had this great Italian restaurant nearby. It was really awesome. And it was really fun sitting and hanging out with Bob Proctor at lunch because he was like a totally normal person. It was really, really amazing. So we were having lunch and everything and talking about this and that. And he finally says, so I thought you were going to start your own freelance writing company. And I was like, well, I think it was fun. I had like and I said, I'm kind of doing it, like I'm working at night. I have this card table in my living room and I am working on a few clients. And he goes, okay, when are you going to start your company? And I was like, well, and he was like, Diane, what is standing in your way? Why are you afraid to make this move? And he said, what is the worst thing that could happen? And I said, well, I could lose my house. I just bought a house. I could lose my house. And then he said, if you lost your house, then what would happen? What's the worst thing that could happen? And I said, well, I could end up homeless. And he said, you could end up homeless. That's what you think? And I said, yeah. Yeah. So at that point, he walked me very patiently through a process to help me understand that direction and trajectory was not going to be in my world. It wasn't in my world. It wasn't a familiar thing in my world. And in the end, he said, why would you think that even if you lost your house, even if you had no business coming in, he said, why would you think that after building up this amazing support net of these amazing family members and friends that you have all around you, why would you think that they would ever let you fail? And I sat there for a moment and he said, let me tell you something, Diane. He said, I won't let you fail. He said, I will be part of that support net. If you do this, I will not let you fail. And he said, sometimes I am willing to believe when you are not willing to believe. And he said, and sometimes I feel like that's my job with a lot of people I meet. And he said, and I'm going to hold the belief for you until you believe yourself. So that was in November. Did I go back and quit at RE/MAX? No, I did not. I thought about it. I got really close to doing it, but I didn't do it until May of the following year. And there's kind of a funny story about that because I actually turned in my resignation and they talked me into staying a little longer than I planned for a really superfluous reason, but that's another story. So here's what happened. On the very last day of my job, I'm sitting at my desk at RE/MAX and they're handing out these bonuses that they promised to hand out. That's why I stayed a little longer. And I got my check. I had nothing left in the office. It was all cleared out. Everything was gone. And I was leaving that afternoon on a flight to Toronto, from Denver to Toronto. And so I left at about lunchtime. I got to the airport. I flew to Toronto and I had a meeting with this huge real estate agent. His name is Craig Proctor. He's still in the real estate industry. He's probably the largest real estate trainer in the world right now. And he is phenomenal. Well, at the time, he was like 28, 29 years old. He was right about my age. And he was making millions of dollars selling hundreds, like over 100 homes. So he was the most successful real estate agent in the world at the time, and definitely the most prolific in North America for sure. And so he hired me to be his marketing director. So I left my Remax International job. I flew up to meet with him and we signed the contract. And immediately it was more money than I was making in a month with just that one signed contract. So he had me fly up there because he was starting a workshop the next morning and he wanted me to sit in on it because he was going to start teaching agents what he did. And this was his way of creating a new stream of income, was starting to do these workshops. So the next morning I got down to the hotel room and he was, already teaching at the front, doing his thing. And I was sitting at the back of the room and in walked Bob Proctor. And I looked at him and I said, what are you doing here? And he looked at me and he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I quit my job. I started my freelance writing company. And now let me tell you that Bob Proctor and Craig Proctor had the same last name and they lived within miles of each other, but they were not related in any way, shape, or form. And they did end up working together quite a bit, but they had met because of Bob speaking, and Craig brought Bob in to help his real estate agent clients sitting in front of him understand how to shift their mindset so that they could sell more real estate homes, because a lot of it has to do with mindset. So that's how Bob explained it to me. I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm here to, teach Craig's people. He wanted me to come in and talk about, what I talk about. And we're just kind of blinking at each other. And he said, how do you like the freelance writing business? And I said, I love it. I signed a contract with Craig yesterday. I'm off and running. They said, well, are you taking on any other clients? And I said, well, yeah, I can take on other clients. And he says, okay, I want to be your next client. So that day, he signed a contract with me and he became my second client on my first full day of owning and operating my freelance writing company. It was astounding. Now, a lot of people say, oh, you got so lucky. How did you get so lucky? You don't get luck. You begin to move forward in the direction that you want, and it begins to meet you halfway. That is the key. I had no expectation that I would ever see Bob Proctor again, that I would ever talk to him again, or that I would ever be hired as his writer, let alone work and write with him for 27 years straight. He became my father figure. He became one of my very, very closest friends, probably my best friend. And what happened in those 27 years of his mentorship with me is just absolutely astounding. Absolutely astounding. Because he had a lot to work with. I had a big filing cabinet in my head. It had a lot of files. And what matters is that it doesn't matter how many files you've got in your filing cabinet head. It doesn't matter how you've been brought up. It doesn't matter what has been drilled into your head about you, about your world. What matters is that you want a shift for yourself. You want a change for yourself, and you're ready to move in that direction. Not just ready, but you are actually taking the first step. The first step with me was reading the Anthony Robbins book and then reading Napoleon Hill. And the interesting thing was when Bob was talking at the front of the room as the keynote speaker, his book of all books was Think and Grow Rich. It was what transformed his life when he was in his mid-20s and at the complete bottom, not knowing what to do next. And he had a mentor who said, read this book. And every single day of his life, Bob read that book until the day he died. He carried it with him everywhere. It was that powerful. Think and Grow Rich is that powerful. working with a mentor who understood that book and had worked with Earl Nightingale, one of the great mind thinkers of all time, that had propelled him forward. But see, he took a step because he wanted to change. I took a step because I wanted to change. And when he talked about Think and Grow Rich from the stage, that was it. I was like, okay, this guy is cool. I need to hear more of what this guy has to say. And that I was hooked. I had no idea he was ever going to ask me to write for him. No idea. So move forward on what you want. Any small movement that you can think of, move forward on what you want. Don't be afraid to ask. I mean, I look back at how bold I was to actually call up there and say, I want to do lunch with Bob. Is he available? I mean, the guy is getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to come down and train people. And I'm way over here in this other department, and I have nothing to do with that event. But I still called and said, I'd like to do lunch with him. Imagine if I had talked myself out of that. What would have happened? Now, I believe in serendipity. I believe that Bob and I were supposed to work together. He believes that we were supposed to work together. We would have found a way. We would have crossed paths in some way, shape, or form. But you've got to take the step. And you have to be willing to ask. And if they say no, it's okay. But if they don't say no, and they usually don't, you're on your way. But you've got to make a decision to act. The decision is key. And that's what I wrangled with all that time. And on the second day or the first day of my business with my first 2 clients, my money income had quadrupled in one day. My whole world began to open up with all sorts of mentors. Craig introduced me to Jay Abraham. Jay Abraham, I apprenticed with Jay Abraham. Bob introduced me to all kinds of people he worked with. You know, Jack Canfield, Mark Victor Hansen, Mary Morrissey, Les Brown. I mean, he opened doors to all of these people, and my life and my business just went like this. It never would have happened if I hadn't felt the need for change and made a decision to start doing something for that change. That's what I'm here to help you with Catalyst Code. That's what I'm here to help you with. I just wanted you to hear that initial story so that you know moving forward that you can create significant shifts in your life, significant shifts where other people look at your life and say, how did that happen? Sometimes I look back at my life and I say, I know exactly how it happened, but it's still what Bob always used to say. He used to say, it never surprises me, but it always amazes me. That's the kind of life you want to have. It never surprises you, but it always amazes you. So I look forward to moving forward with you on Catalyst Code. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about my dog. You're going to want to hear this story. Thank you so much for joining me. Please like, please subscribe, and please share this with your friends. Share this with your peers. I would love to have this ripple as a ripple effect. Make it a great day.